Hope not. So, do apologize for the fact that we started late this evening. If you didn't know, my spiritual gift is actually not preaching and teaching. It's tardiness. But if you were here with us last time, we were talking about what is, by every metric, one of the most difficult and challenging things for people to deal with, whether they're Christians or not. And that is the problem of evil. And we were looking in the book of Habakkuk, an often overlooked and lesser known minor prophet of the Old Testament. Minor in the sense that it's just small. Not that what he said is unimportant, but that it's only 3 chapters long. And we sort of framed our discussion around the problem of evil through the experience of the prophet Habakkuk, because he seems to give voice to a lot of the struggles that many people have. That is, this book does not present an excuse for the problem of evil. It doesn't dismiss the problem of evil. This book begins with the first chapter and the prophet Habakkuk lobbing accusations against God about God not doing anything. And we talked about that last time. We talked also about how God actually answered Habakkuk and said, no, I am doing something, but if I told you what it was, you wouldn't believe me. And he told Habakkuk to take a step back, as it were. And in chapter 2, he kind of says he's going to do as much. He's going to take a sort of a panoramic look at everything that God is trying to show him. But I want to invite you to chapter 3, because what we had spoke of last time was more of a sort of a preface to what I'd like to share with you tonight. What I'd like to share with you tonight is how we are to respond to the problem of evil. Ideally, there's multiple ways we respond to things, at least 2 of those, two ways we respond to things. We respond to things inwardly and outwardly. What I mean is the way you encounter something or engage with something or relate to something, there's the way you talk to yourself about it and deal with it within your own mind, and then there's the way you sort of respond in front of other people or in a group. We'll maybe save that for another time. I want to share with you this evening through Habakkuk chapter 3 how we ought to respond to the problem of evil inwardly. But this is a really interesting book. As we said last time, there's a lot of empathy that I personally have with it. But what we have in chapter 3 is not a solution to evil, but a model in how you ought to respond to it. The evils of this world is something what I've come to recognize is that they're here. This fact of life, the life is filled with all kinds of sorrow and struggle and sin and evil. And for whatever reason, some of us take it as some sort of personal crusade, that it's up to us to come up with an explanation for God's sake so that other people can understand why God allows evil. Or we suppose even more, dramatically, that we should find a way to solve all the problems of the evils of the world. We started this conversation as an installment through a series on apologetics, just this topical, thematic, sort of all kinds of different things, apologetics. When I share with what I would share with you this evening, please do not hear me as doing so in a sense of trying to explain evil or try to resolve evil. That's not our job. Habakkuk realizes that. I want you to imagine, if you would, someone on a beach, maybe a nice sandy beach with white sand, and it actually has blue water, not brown water, blue water. And there they are with a 5-gallon bucket, and they're just bailing water out of the ocean and tossing it back on the seashore. And what they're trying to get all the water out, right? They're just bailing away. And at first they're working fast, they're working energetically, they're working fervently, and then you see them start to slow down and get tired. No one who doesn't want to see that person suffer is going to tell them they're not working hard enough. Because it's pretty clear you can bail away all you wish, but you are never going to exhaust the ocean of its water. It's just not going to happen. Instead, you might want to tell that person, hey, you were never meant to solve that problem by yourself. And I will tell you, it would be easier to bail the water out of the ocean than it would be for you and me to come up with a comparable explanation or solution for all the evils of the world. That is not our job. And I don't know about you, but there's a lot of comfort, at least for me, when I can relish in the fact that certain things are just not my job. We're not called to do that. I'm not sure we've got the fortitude to do that personally. That's not what this book is about. Habakkuk does not explain, try to fix, or eradicate evil. What we have in chapter 3 is not him discovering an answer to evil. It's him laying down a burden he was never meant to carry, and a problem he wasn't necessarily ever meant to solve. You see, faith here does not mean pretending the ocean's waves aren't there. Rather, it is just recognizing that it's God's job to command the sea, if that makes any sense. Now, how the righteous respond to the problem of evil through Habakkuk chapter 3. To better organize our thoughts, as I said, I'm trying to sort of partition them into how we respond within ourselves and how we respond in the eyes of the world and the eyes of our peers. But we're not going to get through that in one night. So just this evening, I want you to think about yourself. What Habakkuk really shows, this inward response to evil. And notice firstly his posture. And look, if you would, at Habakkuk chapter 3 and verse 1, where it says, a prayer of Habakkuk the prophet, according to Shigionoth. Probably butchering that word. I'm going to stop there because that is an important little thing in your Bible that you might not have noticed if I didn't tell you. I certainly didn't. But in a lot of English Bibles, chapter 3 and verse 1 and verse 2 is sort of separated from each other. Is yours like that? You know why? Because that first verse is a very, very important signal. That word, that S word at the end, Shigionoth, whatever that is, it's the same. You see that word in Psalm chapter 7, just for reference. And it is a cue that this is about to be a serious genre shift. That Habakkuk is no longer complaining and dialoguing with God. This is much more of a worship. This is much more of a psalm. In fact, you're going to hear my daughter's name in here twice, at least I think twice, where it says Selah, just like the Psalms. Now, this is obviously not a psalm, but it's a lot like the Psalms. The point is that there is a shift here. There is a shift in the tone, in the purpose. You see right here, he's no longer complaining or arguing. He's worshiping. And that's why that little verse is sort of separated from verse 2 in a lot of English Bibles. It is maybe a musical term, but it tells us there's a strong emotional movement in this. That there's going to be, rises and falls. There's going to be dramatic moments and still moments, just like a song. Do you know, different kinds of music sort of emphasize this in different ways, but certain songs have heavy sections and slow sections. This could have very well been meant for liturgical or ceremonial or corporate communal use. It's a shift. He's no longer complaining to God or arguing with God. He's worshiping. And this is why I want you to see his posture. Now, with that in mind, and now you know why there's a split there, notice if you would in verse 2. Habakkuk says, O Lord, I have heard the report of you and your work. O Lord, do I fear? In the midst of the years, revive it. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. Again, I'm going to stop there. A very psalm-like prayer, but not a complaint. Listen, some of us are really good at complaining. And I will be honest with you all. It seems as though it's been my personal quest over the last few weeks or so to see if I cannot break some sort of personal record for how many complaints I can launch in a single day. I almost feel sorry for some of the people I talk to because I'm starting to be aware of it. Like, halfway through a conversation and I say, like Britney Spears, oops, I did it again. And I just, all this complaining. Some of us are really good at it, trust me. And I'm not saying you don't need to complain. I think we do. I think we need moments to vent. You need to be able to not only feel your feelings, but sort of grapple with them and vent a little bit. That's why your rice pot lid has a little hole in the top. You'll never forget that, will you? But here's the deal. I think Habakkuk has already done that. In chapter 1, Habakkuk is letting it all out. And he's asking God, why don't you do something, God? It's okay to be able to give voice to those ventings. You need to go home after work or after a hard day and just let it out and just vent for 15 minutes, do it. But venting for 3 hours, there's a reason your rice pot lid has a little bitty hole and not just a big gaping window. Point is, Habakkuk is not complaining anymore. That's what I'm trying to draw your attention to. He is worshiping. He's not complaining or whining. Notice he says, I have heard and I fear. That's not meaning he's in terror. He means he's in awe of what God is doing. And he's not even asking for answers anymore. The remarkable thing, he's just praying that God's work would continue. He's not denying God's plan. He's not arguing with God's justice or God's mercy. He's just praying for mercy within God's judgment. Here's something that I think is hard for a lot of folks to really grapple. Again, I'm trying to tell you how we ought to respond to evil inwardly. And I'm calling attention to the prophet Habakkuk's posture, that he's no longer complaining, he is worshiping. I think sometimes if we had our way, we would have God take whatever suffering we're dealing with and just alter it instantaneously. Remove from our lives any sense of struggle. Just like that. Because he can. Will he? Probably not. And what comes to my mind is an interesting story that many of us learned in Sunday school. I know I did. when Jesus walks on the water to the apostles on the Sea of Galilee while they're in the middle of a storm. Now, God is omniscient. He is sovereign. He knows the future. And the Lord knew it was going to be a stormy night on the Sea of Galilee that day. But if you read Matthew 14, he sent them out there, knowing they would endure that. Very quickly, it's Matthew 14:22. Immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds, that is, on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. After he dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but the boat by this time was a long way from land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. I wanted to share that with you because, and you read the rest, the Lord goes out and he meets them on the water. You know, it's a powerful story. The reason I share that with you is because the Lord sent them into that storm. See, a lot of times I think, at least in my experience, if I had my way and I could wave a magic spiritual wand and have my prayers answered, the storms that I'm living through would just be changed. Like this. Wouldn't that be nice? But God doesn't work that way because that's not what's best for us, nor is that according to his plan. His will was for them to go into that storm. And Habakkuk is not praying that God would change the storm. Habakkuk is praying that God would give him peace and encouragement and strength through the storm. That is a very different way to pray. It's a very different way to live, at least in my experience. Habakkuk wasn't praying God calm the storm. He was praying for God's shelter, his grace, his peace through the storm. Notice that posture, and that's what I'm trying to encourage you to seek. A posture of submission and surrender that says, this is the storm. I just need you to get me through this, Lord. Not, why God? Why don't you do something, Lord? Not my will, but yours be done kind of prayer. The prayer of the prophet is only magnified if you notice in verse 3, his perspective. I'm going to read through verses 3 to 7 very quickly because we're short on time. But thinking about his posture, his heart now surrendered to God. Notice his perception now. In verse 3, this is going to sort of sound sort of discombobulated if you don't get what he's referencing, but I'm going to read this to you. Habakkuk 3, verse 3. God came from Teman, and the Holy One from Mount Paran, Selah. His splendor covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise. His brightness was like the light. Rays flashed from his hand, and there he veiled his power. Before him went pestilence, and plague followed at his heels. He stood and measured the earth. He looked and shook the nations. Then the eternal mountains were scattered. The everlasting hills sank low. His were the everlasting ways. I saw the tents of Cushan in affliction. The curtains of the land of Midian did tremble. Do you know what he's doing? This is so powerful. If you want to know how to respond to evil, and you look at the posture of Habakkuk, one that is geared toward prayer, I want you to see how he is perceiving things. What he is doing is calling to remembrance the past acts that God has already done for his people. He's referencing the Exodus with Moses. He's referencing the land, the conquest of the land of Canaan through Joshua. He's referencing all the great things that God had done in the past. In verse 3, he says, God's splendor covered the heavens. The earth was full of his praise. Verse 4 says, his rays flashed from his hand, and there he veiled his power. You see what that is proof of is that God is not ignoring evil. And I know that because when I look at history and when I look at what God has done in the past, I can be given assurance for what God is doing in the present and what he will do in the future. That is, when I say our posture ought to be towards prayer, our perception ought to be ever watchful for not only what's happening now, but mindful of what God has already done. And I think that can give us a great bit of solace in trying to grapple with the problems of the evils of this world. Give you a really simple way of thinking about it. God has never been passive or silent in history, ever. Never been. There's never been a time where God has been retired on a beach somewhere in San Lucia. He doesn't do that. Now, a lot of agnostics have adopted that view because they say that if there's an all-powerful, all-loving God that created the world and it's in the state it's in now, he's got to be out of the office today. He's got to be on vacation or something. Or maybe he just wound up the clock that is the world and just let it go. Because he's definitely not doing anything about it now. At least that's the mentality of a lot of people. But if you look at history, that is not so. One of the greatest examples of this I've had in my own personal experience was with a high school student at Ville Platte High as I was teaching the Holocaust. He was an atheist at the time, praise God. I don't think he's an atheist now. Lucas, the Superman Batman thing in my classroom, he's the one that painted that, if you know what I'm talking about. Everyone wants to know what I'm talking about now. Come see me at work, I'll show you. He comes to me and we're talking about the problem of evil, how God allows bad things to happen to good people, blah, blah, blah. And he comes to me armed with what he thinks is a defeater for theism, for belief. Because he has posed this question to lots of his buddies, lots of his relatives, and not a single one of them could offer a meaningful answer. I don't think it was that much of a defeater. I really thought it was kind of a softball question, to be honest with you. But we're talking about the Holocaust, and he says, well, you say that God chose the nation of Israel for a specific part of his plan, right? Right. The Jews are a pretty substantial part of God's workings with the world, right? Right. Well, why didn't God save them during the Holocaust? If they're so special, why did he allow them to die? And I said, well, to be honest with you, why do you think God didn't save them in the Holocaust? He's like, what are you talking about? I said, yeah, there was 6 to 10 million of them that died, but they're still here. And the things that God was able to accomplish in the meantime, between now and then, is nothing short of miraculous. If you don't understand what I'm talking about, before the Holocaust, if you didn't know, the global Jewish population was around 16.6 million. By 1945, it was about 11 million. That means the total global Jewish population had dropped by about a third. And by other historical metrics and standards, normally that would be the beginning of extinction. Assimilation would take in. The law of assimilation is the fact that my mom's grandparents are from Sicily, which is why you think we talk with our hands and we have curly hair, but I'm as American as apple pie. The only words I know how to say in Italian, mostly, I shouldn't say at church. I am not an Italian, although Dad constantly calls us both Dagos. I'm as American as apple pie, but not so with, WAP. It's not so with Jewish folks. If you don't understand what I'm saying, so they dropped by a third during the Holocaust, but within one generation, the Jewish population rebounded. And by the early 1970s, it sort of replenished. And today, it now stands at somewhat 15 to 16 million again. Never mind the national restoration of the nation of Israel itself in 1948. Never mind a whole bunch of other stuff I wrote down that I won't have time to tell you about to substantiate my point that God did save the Jewish people in the Holocaust. And, he kind of gave it a step back and he scratched his chin. And he said, well, I hadn't thought of that. I said, I know it was one of the most plain and easily observable events of evil in human history. But to say that God was silent in it would be an affront to what we see now. What do I mean by that? Here's what I mean. In terms of assimilation, Jewish existence, preservation, when was the last time you filled out a government form and they had one of those check boxes for race and you saw the selection option of Amalekite or Hittite? You haven't seen one of those, have you? You see some other things that, what is other? Never quite understood that one. Not sure. Not sure. The point of the matter is all those peoples of the Old Testament are gone. Donnie McGee was telling me one time that when he was in Israel, he heard there was a Palestinian Arab tour guide there saying that he was descended from the Canaanites. And Donnie said it made him want to gag. Because through maybe some sort of distant demographic sense, I would say there's, Arab and Middle Eastern folks that may be able to find some sort of lineage through people from Bible times, but there's no Philistines over there. You know what I mean? There's no more Hittites or Jebusites or electrolytes. Just making sure you're paying attention. We're almost out of time here. I'm trying to call your attention to the fact that the prophet Habakkuk is grappling with the problem of evil, not because he's trying to excuse it, but because he is seeing that in the past of God's people, God has not been silent. He calls attention back to the Exodus, what God has done in the days of Moses and Joshua and so on. So how would we deal with the problem of evil now? To recognize the same thing. To not give in to the despair that God is away from his office, but that he is acting even if we don't understand it. And that leads to one final little observation for this evening, and that is the prophet's praise. This is an outpouring of his realization that God's wrath is not random. Judgment, even though on his own people, serves God's purpose. We don't have time to read really the whole thing, so I'm just going to bring your attention to verse 13. You can read verses 8 through 12 if you like, but notice verse 13. We think about the prophet going from his despair in chapter 1 to this worship and this praise. You went out in verse 13, you went out for the salvation of your people, for the salvation of your anointed. You crushed the head of the house of the wicked, laying him bare from thigh to neck. Selah. Habakkuk realizes that salvation is always the goal. It's not as though God is trying to just completely damn his own people by allowing to happen what was going to happen. And if you don't remember, we said last time, one of the things that was troubling to Habakkuk is that the nation of Judah was falling ever further into sin and ruin, and the Babylonian Empire was seemingly getting better and better and better and bigger and bigger, and God is going to use the Babylonians to bring judgment on the nation of Judah. It's sort of a hard pill to swallow for someone on that side of that conflict, but it doesn't make sense then that God is not acting. He is very much acting, even in ways we wouldn't have understood, or in Habakkuk's case, believed. But notice it says that God crushed the head of the house of the wicked. Does that call to mind anything specific to you? Genesis 3:15. God tells the serpent, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring. He, that is Messiah, Christ, shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Some translations say, he will crush your head. That is, the Lord is going to have victory, and Habakkuk sees that. Even in the midst of this struggle, God is still going to be victorious. And if you want a great verse that ties all those together, you ought to write down Romans chapter 16 and verse 20. Romans 16:20 says this, the God of peace will soon crush Satan under your feet. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you. Man, there's a lot there. A lot there. That means very practically that when evil confronts us, whether in the news or in our families or in our own lives, the righteous person does not default to rage, to despair, to accusation. It's something much deeper. You see, what I think we're observing in this text is that Habakkuk, his inward response is not theoretical, it's not armchair philosophy or religion, it's very practical. Habakkuk shows us how to come to God when evil is pressing in or when we start to really see it. We don't go to God with clenched fists, we don't lie, we don't dismiss it, we come honest, prayerful, and humble. We come openly with confusions, with questions, with struggles. That's how this book starts. But it's certainly not how it ends. Because somewhere between that initial complaint and this beautiful song of praise, Habakkuk has made an interesting decision. A decision I think some of us, me especially, need to make ourselves. And that is to stop treating God like he's a defendant and start treating God like God. And recognize it's not my prerogative to understand all of the things in the cosmic deep places of his creation. I am just creation. He is creator. I'm a creature. Very practically, we need to kind of think about what Habakkuk is doing here. So I want to close with a real historical example with what few minutes we have left, because I think it'll sort of tie all this together really well. But as far as what he is talking about here, why history is so important, faith often survives not because of some sort of new epiphany, so much as it survives on remembrances and realizations of what God has already done. He tells Habakkuk in chapter 1 and 2, look and wonder and be astounded. Look around you. I'm already acting. By recalling God's past faithfulness, by rehearsing his acts in history, by anchoring ourselves in what we know is true, even when what we see is troubling, there is a discipline there that is so helpful. It doesn't happen automatically. It's not necessarily easy to do things that way, but I think it's a powerful thing that Habakkuk does. It's not weakness to come before God with prayer. It's not naive to anchor your mind in his past faithfulness, and it's not wrong to choose to worship him even when the world seems to give you every reason not to. The night I lost Dad, I remember falling into tears in several people's shoulders that night, but I was talking to Ben, and he was the only one who I could try to get the words out, and I couldn't. But I was reminded of the fact that when Job lost everything, when David lost his child, do you know what those two guys did? They worshiped. And that defies human ability, I suppose. That doesn't come naturally. But that is the proper response, the inward response to what we see in the world. not to try and explain it, not even to necessarily try to understand it. It's not your prerogative to understand it. You trying to understand some of that stuff is no different from my toddler trying to ask me why when I tell her not to go run in the street during traffic, as if there's a lot of traffic on that street. You know what I'm saying. A lot of times we feel irritated because the toddler is being so insolent as to ask why. But when we try and play God and understand some of these things, it's much the same situation, at least to me. So here's my real world example. And some of you already probably know her story, but a handful of you, I'm sure, have never heard I'm not going to give you the full story, but Corrie ten Boom. If you don't know who Corrie ten Boom was, she was a Dutch Christian woman who, along with her family, helped hide Jewish refugees during World War II. In 1944, she and her sister Betsy were arrested by the Nazis, and they were sent to a concentration camp that was known as Ravensbrück, which is one of the, well, they were all bad, but this one was particularly infamous. But listen carefully to what didn't happen. She was, by the way, trying to do the right thing, Christian girl and her family, trying to hide Jews from the absolute embodiment of evil that was Nazi Germany. Here's what didn't happen. They were never given an explanation for the evil that they experienced. They were never spared from the horrors of the camp. They were not delivered from the sufferings there. Her sister died there. They were never given any sort of explanation for any of that. But in the middle of that camp, surrounded by starvation, disease, violence, and death, those two girls held secret prayer services in their barracks. They read scripture, they prayed quietly, they worshiped. At one point, Corrie records in one of her writings that she was complaining about the fleas in their barracks. And I don't know if you've ever had to deal with lice or fleas. It's not pleasant. And her sister pulled a page out of Habakkuk's book, and she said they ought to thank God for the fleas. Thank God for the fleas. I'm reminded of what Brother Seth said during our Thanksgiving service when he said that he was thankful for the hard times we've endured because it's grown us as a people. Here's the thing. Because of those fleas, guess what? The Nazi guards would stay away from their barracks, giving them a chance to have prayer meetings and all that kind of stuff safely. It's amazing. Now, here's the key point. Corrie ten Boom did not respond to evil by understanding it, fixing it, or eradicating it. She responded inwardly the same way Habakkuk did. Her posture was prayer, not protest. Her perspective was anchored in what God had already revealed, not in what she could presently see. And her praise was offered before her deliverance ever even came. Here's what she said that I thought was really good. She famously said, "There is no pit so deep that God's love is not deeper still." And she is walking in that same stream of faith that Habakkuk found, that you can read about later in chapter 3. We referenced last time that even if the world falls apart, I'm still going to trust and praise God. Until God finally ends evil altogether, this is how we ought to respond inwardly. God willing, next week we'll maybe think about how we ought to respond outwardly with one another and with the people we are in the world with. And the little ones being here, if that's not cue for the fact that I should stop talking now. Yep. Yep. Ariel.